With the beginnings of what will become the Roman invasion, one thing I want to do is have a quick look back at the landscape that we're dealing with in Britain. What is causing Britain to be such a target? We've talked a little bit about it leading into this, but I want to go into further detail. So we're going to get to that right now. Welcome back to the Roman Britain podcast, episode 7, Britannia, Divisa. When Rome invaded Britain in 43 CE, it did not land on a passive island. It entered a landscape already changing. Archaeology makes this very clear. Across southern Britain in the decades before the invasion, settlements were growing larger, trade networks were intensifying, and coinage was spreading, and the political power was consolidating. Britain was not frozen in time, it was dynamic. And that dynamism, that competition between kingdoms and elites, created the conditions that made Roman intervention possible. In this episode, we're going to explore Britain in the generation right before the conquest. And this is about the expansion, the rivalries, the trade, exile, and ambition that made it possible for Rome to take advantage of all this. It is about how archaeology, of course, allows us to see political change unfolding in the soil, the metal, the timber, long before Roman soldiers arrived on the island. By the end of this episode, the invasion of 43 CE should feel less like a bolt from the blue and more like the climax of the forces already in motion. And this will be our leading point to get where we're going. So next time, we'll be covering more about the actual invasion itself, more about the dirty details, and how we get there specifically with the political goings-on in Rome at the time. By the early 1st century CE, southern Britain was dominated by powerful tribes and confederations. The Catalaveni, the Trinovantes, and the Arbetes, as well as the Regni, were the main tribes that were a part of all this conflict at this point. These territories, with their agricultural bases, their warrior elites, and increasingly complex economies, were opportunities for the Romans. If you want to understand the complexity of these societies, all you have to do is look at the archaeology. Across Herefordshire, Essex, Hampshire, and Kent, we find large enclosed settlements known as oppida. These were not temporary hill forts as we've seen in the past. They were extensive defensive zones, often covering hectares of land, containing storage pits, craft workshops, elite residences, and evidence of organized street layouts. Basically, they were harbingers of towns, villages, and cities. Sites such as Canalodunum, as it will be called in the Roman period, or modern Colchester, Calavea, modern Silchester, demonstrate planning and permanence. Grain storage pits show agricultural surplus, metalworking debris shows specialized production. Imported goods, of course, show the long-distance trade, something we've talked about. So all of these things are showing a people that are not moving. They're not being forced away by weather. They're living in a central location. They are formalizing that, and they're formalizing the control within that area. They're setting up borders and, in effect, becoming more like nations and less like tribal units. At the center of this transformation, of course, stood Cunobelinus. His power base was Camalodunum, and the archaeology at Colchester reveals a major late Iron Age center before the Roman conquest. The site included extensive earthworks, elite compounds, and large areas of industrial activity, showing that this place was incredibly important and that, to even show it further, there was coinage being minted here. The minted gold and silver coins bared the name of the leader, and along with it, a very important Romanesque title of Rex. They were obviously copying the Latin forms, the Roman styling, the idea of having the head of the leader on the coin, the minting of what amounted to, rather than, and I've said this before, but rather than financial uses, they were more about gifts and honors and ways of recognizing someone's association. So they didn't work the same way we use them, or even as the Romans used them, but they still had their uses. And it was very common in the ancient time to use them in this way. It would be the Romans that would use them more and more as coinage and minting money to determine as sort of substitutions for weight and for goods. I think it's important to remember that that's not normal across all of society in the ancient world. This is more of a Roman and Mediterranean invention that's become more and more important as time goes on. This is, of course, not just symbolic decoration. This coinage represented authority over the territory, the control of resources, and the ability to standardize economic exchange. The distribution of these coins across southern Britain show the extent of the influence of Cunobelinus. Imported amphorae from Italy and Gaul, having been found at elite sites, associate with his rule, and of course show the links between the trade movements in Europe at the time through the Romans to Britain and how those were intermingling. And it shows that this network is quite large. Camulodunum was not isolated, it was instead connected to the larger continent. Cunobelinus was building something close to a southern British hegemony and in effect becoming a client king of the Romans in the process. To the south lay the kingdom of the Artabetes, ruled in the early 1st century by Verica. Their capital was Calavene Arturbetum. This site, also known as Silchester, reveal something very remarkable. Before the Roman invasion, Calavea already had organized street patterns and substantial defense embankments. This suggested an emerging urban center even before the Roman planning was imposed over it. Coinage from Verica's reign feature Latin inscriptions and Roman imagery, very similar. This modeling of the Roman design and the Roman aesthetic was something that we were seeing more and more in Britain during this period. And of course, that then shows that there are alignments between these groups and Rome. Archaeology also shows increased imports into the Artabetic territory during Verica's rule. Continental pottery and amphorae also appear with greater frequency at this period. The Artabetes appear deeply embedded in the Roman trade networks, much like their fellows to the north of them, and will be a key partner with Rome eventually. They are effectively client state kings and client state states, while to the north, there were instead powerful kingdoms that were not looking to align with Rome, but were looking to expand and to grow and become more powerful. Archaeological layers suggest there was an instability in the late 30s CEs, distributing all of this power and control. And because of this, production patterns changed. Things started to move about. You know, the manufacturing of metal items, the archaeology or the agricultural land use was changing as well. And of course, like I said, there was, at least in England, a formalization of cities and of towns and of villages that was happening in a way that was not happening in the north, and especially in the west and the far north, as those tribes were not in that position. After Cunobelinus's death, his son Tagodumnus and Caractacus appear to have continued this expansion. Archaeologically, we see shifts in coin circulation and the settlement influences in territories once dominated by the Archabetes. And because of this, Camulodunum's preeminence increases. Southern territories start to show signs of political absorption in the larger political power base. Roman historian Cassius Dio suggests that Verica was driven from his kingdom, showing this change. Archaeology cannot confirm exile directly, but the contradictions of the Archabetic coinage and the apparent dominance of the Catalavenes issues strongly implied political displacement. This is where British politics intersects with Roman ambitions, as expelled pro-Roman rulers provide Rome with justification to intervene, but internally, this was also part of the British state formation. The Catalavenae were not attacking Rome, they were just consolidating their territory and absorbing fellow Britons into their territory. Archaeology across this area, such as Kent, Essex, and Hampshire, show dense concentrations of imported goods. Dressel amphorae from Italy, Gallic, Belgic pottery, and glassware from the Rhineland, all of which are Roman controlled in this period. The import cluster is mostly, of course, in elite context. You're not going to find this in the local, average farmer or even necessarily a low-level baker or merchant. They're just not going to have the power and the financial wherewithal to be able to acquire these goods. But they are slowly growing in on the elite, and they're becoming more and more distributed. Of course, it was mostly a political maneuver. It was a showing of power. Elites who controlled ports, trade routes, and other things like it gained a lot of power. Sites like Hengistbury Head show sustained cross-channel contact, which then, of course, helped that area grow in power and economy. And, of course, Britain was economically entangled with Gaul long before the Romans showed up. Strabo, for example, noted that Britain's exported metals, hides, and grain were important to the Roman structures. Archaeological finds of metalworking centers, particularly of iron production in the Weald, support this. Rome did not see Britain as an emptied land. It did not see it as a completely passive or paganized place where everybody was completely useless, but rather they were something of a economic partner, something important enough to be useful to capture. And of course, the disruption in southern Britain threatened this trade stability, which is a great reason that we've seen over and over in history that people use in order to grab land. In contrast, Western Britain shows far fewer imports before 43 AD. I think that's not to anyone's surprise. In territories associated with the Silures and the Ordovise, settlement patterns remain dispersed. Hill forts, such as those in South Wales, continue to show occupation, but without heavy Roman trade goods. Excavations reveal roundhouses, storage pits, and defensive banks, but little continental material culture. So in other words, they are still looking very similar to their Celtic past. The era in South Wales has not changed massively from the one that was before it. Power and accumulation of wealth is still the old ways. It doesn't imply that they were backward or that they were backward in their ways. It just reflects the different economic and political priorities of that area. Power was less centralized. Trade was less Mediterranean facing. Authority was more local. Roman methods of elite co-option would not work here quite the same, and they would have to work and deal with a completely different setup. By the early 40s CE, southern Britain was undergoing, again, as I said, a rapid consolidation, and yet the rest of Britain was still very sparse, still very underpopulated, still very much spread out. You have chiefs, you have tribal units, you have family units still spreading across. There isn't necessarily the same focus and centralization that we see happening, especially in southeastern England. This is something you have to keep in mind with all of these things. It will change, but it's not a quick change. And of course, this created an opportunity for Rome to move forward. They were, of course, seeing the opportunity that was being afforded to them and using their tried and true method of creating opportunity through the appeal, in quotes, of the local tribal leaders to the Romans to come protect them, to defend them against these invaders to their land, so that the Romans could justify that they were not actually fighting an active offensive war, but rather a defensive war to help their allies. It's a very useful tactic and very helpful. Of course, as we move into the northern half of England, we enter a very different political landscape. In what is now northern England and southern Scotland lived the peoples such as the Brigantes. The Brigantes controlled vast territory stretching across much of northern Britain. Archaeology suggests that it was a loose confederation of peoples rather than a tightly centralized kingdom, so nothing like the southern eastern neighbors. Large hill forts, enclosed settlements, and evidence of elite metalwork indicate power and hierarchy. However, the scale of political integration appears weak, and much weaker than the southeast. Further north still, in what is now called Scotland, lived groups who later Roman writers would call the Caledonii. The term Pict, of course, doesn't appear in these Roman sources until the 3rd century. However, the communities which would later be grouped under that label were already present in the 1st century. Archaeologically, northern Scotland in this period was characterized by brochs, massive circular dry stone towers found especially in the Highlands and the islands, and duns, smaller fortified enclosures. Roundhouse settlements with continuity stretching back centuries. Again, this is a style that's used all across the islands, so it's not like it would not be used by these people just because they're a little different than, say, the ones to the south of them. And in a way, it shows the continuity of the population. And of course, what this showed was that most of this was defensive and that it was built in local authorities, chiefs, tribal units, rather than massive confederations or in a kingdom. They were proto-urban centers, but not necessarily in the way we would think of a more modern-esque looking center or even an ancient Roman center. Roman goods, of course, were extremely rare in northern Scotland before 1843, and of course this shows us that while southern Britain was economically entangled with Rome, the rest of Britain was definitely not, and continued to not be for a very long time. From a Roman perspective, the north was unknown, distant, and logistically challenging. It was, in a way, on the edge of the map, and so not as clear or as understood. From a British perspective, northern societies didn't know a lot about Rome either. They were not shaped by continental trade in the same way as the southeast, and thus had very little contact with them. They may have had more contact with northern European neighbors than they ever had with southern ones, because that's kind of what happened all through their history. So it makes sense that that would be the case here. This would, of course, matter a great deal after the invasion, because it would show why Scotland, especially northern Scotland, remained very difficult for the Romans to take, not just because it was in the mountainous highlands, but also that there was no need for or want for Roman culture or Roman nationalization, in effect. Of course, as this is affiliated with the Welsh History Podcast, we got to talk about Wales, and Wales is important in the Roman Britain context. As we turn west, we encounter societies that later prove to be some of Rome's most persistent opponents: the Silures, the Ordovices, the Dementae, and there will be a few others, are all the main tribes that they deal with. Archaeology in Wales shows that landscapes of hill forts and defended enclosures and dispersed farmsteads. Sites such as Tre'r Ceiri in North Wales show substantial fortifications and long-term occupation, yet these, unlike their southeastern neighbors, were not urban centers in the Mediterranean sense. They were rather defensive community hubs that later might become something different, but for the moment are much more like a traditional Celtic style Iron Age settlement. Metalworking evidence suggests local production and exchange, but there was far less imported Roman material than, say, southern England, which would again lead to coinage being far less widespread. In fact, without the Romans, who knows when Wales would have had coinage, because when the Romans disappeared, coinage was very slow to re-enter Wales. This suggests that economic power was, of course, not structured on large trade networks on the continent. Authority appears to be more localized and probably much more agricultural based. Power may have rested in kinship groups and warrior elite rather than centralized kingships such as the Collebenus types. This structural difference is crucial because it means that they weren't easily co-opted into the Roman methods, and that made it much more difficult when you're negotiating or trying to defeat someone if you can't relate to them, if you can't set up an obvious pairing of authority that makes sense. And so Roman invasions in Wales were much more difficult and much harder, and we'll talk in large detail about why. In Wales, that model, of course, of Roman society and Roman culture were harder to implement. There were fewer obvious nodes of power to capture, and of course, the terrain also mattered, much like in northern Scotland. Upland valleys, dense woodlands, and rugged hills created natural defenses and natural advantages for the defenders. Archaeology in Wales continues to show the settlement rather than abandonment in this period, which would suggest that there is resilience there for the Welsh, but it is a resilience built on probably long suffering, if we were to be blunt. When Rome eventually turns west, it would face not a collapsing political order, but rather a durable one, and one that it didn't necessarily defeat so much as co-opt. And finally, in this grouping, let's talk about the Southwest with Demonia and the Atlantic networks. In the far southwest, in the areas around Devon and Cornwall, lies Demonia. This territory is an important one and a key one for the ancient world. Archaeology here shows distinctive patterns. Hill forts such as Castle Dore and the Cornish enclosures demonstrate defensive settlements, but there was also strong evidence of Atlantic trade networks. As we knew before, Cornwall was rich in tin, making it a key trade hub during both the Bronze and Iron Age. Tin had been traded for centuries along the Atlantic seaways. This trade connected the southwest of Britain not only to Gaul, but also to Iberia, modern Spain. Material culture in this region showed continuity with Atlantic traditions rather than the Mediterranean influence. Imported Roman goods are present, but they're far less dominant than in Kent and Essex. This suggests that Demonia was economically outwardly looking, but not dependent on Rome. From Rome's perspective, the Southwest was a valuable mineral wealth generator and definitely one that they had to capture. From their perspective, the locals looked at Rome, initially at least, as a trading partner amongst several. Again, they would see diversity, whereas the Romans would want uniformity. Southern Britain was turning towards the continent. Wales was structurally decentralized. Northern Britain was fortified and regionally distinct, and the southwest was Atlantic facing. Meanwhile, the southeast and the northern part of England were much more in the target of the Romans as they arrived. Britain was divided politically, economically, and culturally, but I would also argue geographically. And all of this kind of created the stew that allowed the Romans to step in. By the early 40s CE, Britain was not one political entity, it was a mosaic. In the southeast, the larger kingdoms were consolidating power, minting coins, and interacting closely with Rome. In Wales, smaller scale political units occupied defensible landscapes with limited continental integration. In the north, confederations such as the Britannias controlled large territories without full centralization. In Scotland, broch-building communities remained beyond the meaningful Roman economic influence. In the southwest, instead, they participated in long-standing Atlantic trade routes. Archaeology makes one thing clear. Rome was about to invade not a single Britain, not a unified island, but rather many Britons. Everything different, everything unique, and everything much more difficult than they were initially probably believing based on Caesar's reports. Some regions, of course, would adapt quickly to the Roman urbanization and administration. Others would resist for decades and yet still absorb themselves within the Roman communities, and we'll talk about this in the next few episodes. The invasion of 43 CE would not be a conquest of the island, it would be the beginning of a regional process unfolding at different speeds across a very different society. Britain before AD or CE 43 was not awaiting civilization, it was experiencing state formation, economic expansion, and territorial rivalry. Archaeology shows this consolidation in the southeast and the resilience in the west. When Rome finally crosses the Channel, it enters a landscape already structurally powerful and one that understood itself. Division did not cause conquest, but it made that conquest much more plausible. This is why so much of what we see in the later discussions revolves around this co-opting of some tribes and conquering of others, of resistance, revolt, and death, or coercion, or financial remuneration, or take your pick of all the different options that we see in front of us in this circumstance. So much of what we know about and understand about Roman Britain after this period is controlled so frequently by the Romans having all of the written material and controlling the narrative. It would be wonderful if we ever had a British version of this where they gave us their take on what was going on that wasn't hundreds of years after the fact, because realistically, any British writer after this writing about this is relying on the Cassius Dios, the Strabos, the Tacitus. So much of these understandings of what Britain is come from them. So much similarity in a way to the way medieval Britain will be perceived through the few writings that we have, especially in the period before the developments of England, and it's shortly after conquest by the Normans, where things up until that point really aren't well collected and corroborated. And so you can get people like Geoffrey Monmouth writing these massive histories, in quote, which become so influential because there's so little actually written and so much of a vacuum of information that it's very easy for someone who's trying to fill those gaps to make up so much of what we have and what we think we know that it becomes incredibly difficult to separate the truth from the lies, from the speculative to the actually mythological. And so much of it is just based on one or two people's perspectives on things. All of this is to say that we will delve more into this, but be aware that Rome's entering a place that, yes, it doesn't have writing that we know about, but it has its own systems, its own understanding of the world that is going to now be very affected by an invading force that has a very different understanding of the world and a very different understanding of how it perceives that world. And that's something to keep in mind as we go on. So with all that said and done, thank you all for watching or listening today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach out to me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. If you want to, you can also reach out to me on social media, usually at Welsh History Pod, with the one exception being Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. That's the page effectively, and you can always reach out to me there. If I'm slow on getting back to you, that I apologize, but I do try and contact people when I notice these things. I will say I'm noticing something coming up, which is interesting. As new people are watching episodes, especially the older episodes, one perspective I'm noticing is people are commenting on those and correcting my obvious mistakes in those early episodes. And it's like almost frustrating, because that's why I started this particular series, is to try and address some of those deficiencies. So I hope we start to address them. I hope when you listen to these, it will address a lot of the problems that people have with some of the early episodes. With all that said and done, thank you, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.